Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next edition of CFO Insights. I'm Lorraine DeBono, Managing Partner of FLG Partners, and we're the preeminent interim CFO and board advisory firm in the US. Today, we are happy to have Greg Johnstone join us for an interview about his financial career, both before and as a partner at FLG. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Greg and his background. He joined FLG in 2021 with over 20 years of financial leadership experience with companies in the development and early commercialization stages. He has focused on technology-oriented businesses, particularly in healthcare, med tech and diagnostics, and also in hardware and tech software. As a CFO, Greg is a very trusted partner and sounding board to his CEOs. His expertise lies in delivering exceptional financial planning and analysis, as well as strategic and operational planning. His fundraising efforts have raised over $250 million from VCs, banks, angels, and strategic partners, with instruments that include preferred stock, convertible notes, warrants, venture debt, and non-dilutive structures. In addition to leading the finance and accounting functions, Greg often oversees areas which include IT, facilities, HR, and legal. Before joining FLG, Greg was an independent consultant for multiple early-stage venture-backed companies. Before that, he was head of finance at Oxygen and Ventus Medical. Previously, Greg was co-founder and CFO for Sensant, which successfully sold to Siemens. He began his career in engineering roles in the software industry, designing large-scale information systems for Fortune 500 companies and governments. Greg earned his BS and his MS in engineering degrees from UC Berkeley and Santa Barbara, and an MBA from Babson, and he's fluent in both Swedish and Spanish. Okay, so welcome, Greg. We're delighted that you are part of the FLG team. So let's begin our conversation. So first, Greg, tell us how you got started and give us a snapshot of some of the key CFO roles you've had during your career and what you've achieved in those roles.
Thank you, Lorraine. The way I got into finance and became a CFO is kind of a funny story. It really wasn't by design initially. It was more a matter of me not stepping back quickly enough. As you had mentioned, I was an engineer and was working on software development and design. And then I went back to business school to get my MBA without a real particular functional area that I was focusing on, but more as a matter of getting exposure to entrepreneurship and broadening my management skill set. Well, midway through that program, I started a small company with friends, and none of us was a finance person. I had basic MBA level accounting and finance courses. And I figured somebody had to keep track of the money, and it couldn't really be that hard, right? Well, fast forward 7 years later, and I'd gotten this fantastic hands-on education in financial leadership of a small company by taking it from concept stage through to successful exit. I was very privileged to have had that experience at a young age. It wasn't a home run exit, but everyone did pretty well, and it provided me the most accelerated learning process of my career. That also turned out to be fortuitous for my further professional development. As you can imagine, as often is the case with M&A exits, as the CFO, I wasn't really necessary after the company was acquired. But during the process of negotiating the deal, I had built a relationship with the CFO of the acquiring company. And so he asked me to stay on board to lead some M&A projects. I thought that sounded interesting, so I jumped in and spearheaded a few M&A deals, which involved selling off a factory in Los Angeles, buying out a joint venture partner on a JV in Korea, and exploring some other potential deals.
It's interesting what you had said. So in M&A deals, right, the CFO of the acquired company is always almost the first one to go with the general counsel, right?
Yep.
But sometimes I think that those transitions can be a little bit too early, and it might be worth keeping on that acquired company CFO, like in your case, because they can handle certain things that the acquiring company may not know about or not have that knowledge. So interesting. But in my experience as an M&A, as somebody who's done M&A, and if I'm the acquired company CFO, I typically leave very, very soon thereafter the deal.
Yeah, definitely. Well, my second role was quite different. In that role, I got to experience coming into an existing organization from the outside and having to make sense of it and get it on track. And that was a very different situation than what I dealt with previously. And that job happened to start on Monday, September 15th of 2008, which some of us recall was the day that Lehman Brothers went under in what is still the largest bankruptcy filing in US history. And of course, the financial markets went into complete meltdown.
Oh, I remember that day well. I had just taken my first job as a CEO, and we were about to raise about a $50 million capital round, and the deal came to a complete halt for several months. That was a tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience as well was that all of a sudden access to money became a really big problem.
Oh
And
yeah.
as I quickly realized, this company that I was with only had 3 months of cash left. And so we were rapidly running toward a fiscal cliff. And in contrast to my first role, where we built this company slowly over time, and I was intimately familiar with all aspects of the operations, in this case, literally on my first day on the job, the CEO and I were sitting down and completely overhauling the business plan. I had barely figured out how to navigate to the restroom, and I was
Mhm.
navigating the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. Ultimately, with a lot of hard work and a little bit of luck, and we were able to articulate a viable plan for the company, and ultimately closed a $40 million round on the day before Thanksgiving that year, and so we could breathe a little bit more easily.
That's amazing because when you think of what happened in September and that you were able to close before Thanksgiving, that actually is amazing because on my $50 million capital raise, it took us 8 months. So,
Yeah.
good for you in that case. And it sounds like that was an amazing formative learning experience and a good one, right? Because what you learn is that cash is king and you never, ever want your company to run out of cash. And that's why I think CFOs need to always do those 13-week cash forecasts and know exactly where the money is and how long you've got it, right?
Yeah, it really was a fantastic learning experience in a variety of ways. Among other things, I really learned a lot about the relationship between the CEO and the CFO. In this case, the CEO was about 30 years older than me. It was this larger than life personality who dominated the room, accustomed to giving orders without a lot of discussion. And most of the time he was spot on, but he wasn't always right. And there were certain things that I could see that he didn't see initially.
Mhm.
And there was a lot at stake in those days because we were making make or break decisions for the company on a regular basis. And in retrospect, it's obvious that you have to be able to stand up and point out when the CEO's on the wrong track or misinterpreting something important. Because if you don't do that, you're just setting yourself and the CEO and the company up for problems further down the line. But it's not
Mhm.
always comfortable. And I found that in many cases, I was the only one willing to stick my neck out. And that CEO actually paid me a couple of compliments that really stuck with me, probably because he wasn't the type to give out a lot of compliments.
And being the only one in the room to kind of stick your neck out, which we CFOs have to do often, is can be tricky, sometimes very unpopular, but it's absolutely essential for a CFO. So tell us what the compliments were.
The first one was, he said, Greg, you're a pain in the ass, but that's okay because that's why I have you here. So his point went back to
Mhm.
that willingness to say no, which is necessary for a
Mhm.
CFO. Now, if you're
Mhm.
only saying no and you're not contributing creatively and positively to try to get to a positive solution to yes, then you're not really helping. But as CFO, you have to be intellectually honest and you have to be willing to say no sometimes.
Absolutely agree. So what was the second compliment?
He said, it's so refreshing to ask a business question and get a business answer instead of asking a business question and getting an accounting answer.
Well, that is very, very true, right? There's such a clear distinction between accounting and business leadership. And as a CFO, you must know that distinction clearly and think about the whole of the business and all of its financial implications, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Accounting is absolutely essential for the work we do in finance and business in general. And in many ways, it's the foundation of what we do. But it doesn't tell us the entire story. It doesn't tell us the how or the why. It doesn't tell us much about the future or how we want to get
Mhm.
to where we want to go. So as CFO, to address business challenges, you really have to look at the fundamentals and get to the heart of the matter and not get caught up strictly in the accounting treatment of things. And I think my ability to do that and be a problem-solving partner to CEOs has really helped me out and set me apart a bit, coming into situations where the CEO was perhaps, not that happy working with the prior CFO.
Well, you do have those exceptional FP&A skills, and you see things through the prism of financial strategy. And sometimes when you don't have accounting background, I don't think you do either. It can be very helpful from the standpoint of strategic finance work and FP&A skills, which drives so much of business strategy, right? But what a great and meaningful journey that you've had coming from an entrepreneurial beginning, right? And then navigating the 2008 financial crisis and so forth. Um, Pivoting a little bit now, tell us about what you believe is, or what makes a successful CEO CFO relationship.
Yeah, well, the CEO has the loneliest job in any company. On the one hand, the CEO is the singular focus of the board members, investors, and all of their concerns. On the other hand, everyone in the company is looking up to the CEO for answers, not to mention a paycheck. CEOs by nature tend to be tough, self-confident, but they're human. And in my experience, the CFO is often the only person that the CEO can really open up to and express doubts and frustrations, in part because the CFO is often the only person on the CEO's staff privy to all of the same confidential information, participating in the closed sessions of the board, et cetera. And many times it's dawned on me that the value I'm adding at any given point isn't always related to the balance sheet or the budget or the forecast. It's acting as an objective, experienced sounding board to the CEO, sometimes helping him or her think through the best way to handle personality conflicts. Sometimes it's giving frank advice, feedback when it's asked for, and sometimes it's just letting them vent. So there are a lot of situations where those required skills are more along the lines of communication, empathy, and perception, which are not really the words that first come to mind when you're describing a CFO typically.
Well, I would actually say that in my own experience, and I think this is true across the board, that what makes an exceptional CFO is not the traditional skill set, it's those soft skills that I think make an exceptional CFO stand out. And it's such an important part of the toolkit, because as a CFO, you need to act as a leader and confidant, right, to your CEO. And those soft skills are crucial because you want that CEO to listen to you, right? You need to have the ability to influence and persuade, which then allows you to bring people with you and to communicate well to employees, the different stakeholders of the company in terms of its story, its goals and values. So all super important. Now let's shift again and talk a bit about company objectives and how you work to meet them. CFOs, as you know, must always balance a company's short and long-term goals when deciding which strategic moves to make and how much an investment to put behind those moves. So share with us an illustration or an example of how you've made those trade-offs as a CFO.
Yeah, well, a huge element of business planning is thinking through the sequencing and timing of different activities, which inherently force you make trade-offs between short and long-term objectives. And when you're part of a strong executive team, you're surrounded by sharp, conscientious people who like to do high-quality work, and they like to be proactive, getting a head start so they can make sure to deliver whatever the company needs from their functional area as soon as possible. And challenge is that we live in a resource-constrained reality. For a startup, capital is very expensive. Cash becomes somewhat less costly each time you achieve what I like to call bankable milestones, which are these valuation inflection points where you retire certain risks to the business and thereby justify a higher valuation on your next round of financing. So arguably, you really shouldn't spend a dime on any activity that doesn't contribute directly to getting to that next bankable milestone. Anything that can wait should wait, and you can fund those other activities later with cheaper money. Of course, the counterpoint to that argument is A, that there can be competitive pressure that forces you to think about getting to market as soon as possible, and B, the IRR for early investors. That 5 or 10x exit is more valuable if you hit it in 4 years rather than 6 years. But in my experience, which has been largely with medical device companies in early stages, the company's own balance sheet is generally a much greater risk than time to market competition. And concerning cost of capital, it gets much more expensive if you run out of cash and don't have anything fundamental to show for it. If you run a bunch of projects in parallel and they're each 80% complete, that's not going to do you any good because VCs are not like high school teachers. They don't tend to give partial credit.
No, they never give you partial credit.
Never, yeah. So it's essential to focus the vast majority of your resources on retiring the greatest risk as cheaply as possible before you move on to the next milestones. And you should have a healthy buffer in your budget to account for hiccups that can go on in your core critical path projects. So it's better to over-resource your must-haves and under-resource your nice-to-haves. And so that means doing things sequentially rather than parallel. And that means moving more slowly than you'd like in a lot of areas. But I think there's an appropriate expression that I learned from a friend of mine who served in the Coast Guard, which is slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Oh, I like that one. That's a good one. And I couldn't agree with you more, by the way, in terms of knowing when and what to trade off can certainly make or break an organization. And totally get that. So also, as you know, things don't always go according to plan. So tell us, Greg, a story about a situation in which you had to give one of your CEOs some really bad news, or needing to tell he or she something that you knew that they really didn't want to hear. So how do you present that news, and what was the CEO's reaction, and how did you respond to their response?
We know my plans are pretty much always spot on, so I don't really know if I have a response. Do you have another question? No, seriously, things not going according to plan happen all the time to one extent or another. Hopefully, most of the time you have contingencies built in to address what you might do when things go, certain foreseeable things go wrong. But most of the companies that I work with are working on brand new products that are entirely different than anything currently available, which means that what they're doing is hard. And so things can and do go wrong. One episode that's still vivid in my mind years later occurred at a company about 6 months after we had raised a really large round of financing that was going to last the company about 2.5 years. The company had just launched a consumer medical device that had FDA approval, but did not yet have insurance reimbursement. We had done extensive market surveys, which indicated that there was a pretty significant portion of the patient population that would be willing to pay out of pocket for the device because it was relatively inexpensive and gave a much better patient experience than the alternative. And so we launched the product on the premise that we would go after that out of pocket market and that it would be significant enough for us. Well, sales did not take off as expected, and there were a lot of different interpretations about what the early sales data meant. But 6 months in, the trend was very clear to me. Hardly any patients were willing to pay out of pocket, so we would need to focus our efforts on getting insurance reimbursement. The problem was the insurance companies were going to require a greater body of clinical data published in peer-reviewed journals before they would begin to cover our device. And from start to finish, that process was going to take about 3 years. So I had to tell the CEO that even though we were feeling fat and happy with 2 years of cash in the bank, we needed to slash costs starting now. If we didn't do that, in 2 years, we were going to be out of cash without anything to show for it. We would have a clinical study in process, which would have zero value for raising it the next round. So we were going to need to make our existing cash last 3 years so that we could complete our study and ultimately get reimbursement in place, which would then justify raising another round of financing. And so that meant that we were really going to have to cut pretty much all of our expenses, including staff, that were not directly related to the product and to the clinical study, which essentially meant getting rid of sales and marketing and greatly cutting back on G&A costs.
I can feel for you in that experience because I've had similar ones as a CFO in medical device companies. When something goes awry, the product isn't ready, you don't get reimbursement, there's a software glitch in the in one of the pieces of the device, and you're kind of back to zero, meaning you have to kind of slash and cut expenses hard, even though you might think you're flush with cash now. So those are really, really difficult situations. And I can only imagine how the CEO would respond to a message like that. Tell us more.
Yeah, he was not initially very receptive, in
Mhm.
part because it really contradicted the use of proceeds that we'd articulated
Right.
to investors, just 6 months earlier when we had done the prior financing. So we had quite a few long conversations over a week or two. And we ultimately really could not see any positive scenario
Mm.
that could result from our current course of action. And so ultimately, the CEO did concur with my assessment. We initiated a discussion with the board and ultimately made the cuts that were necessary.
Yeah, those are such tough messages, and also having to tell your board that might be overly optimistic and not necessarily wanting to raise another round or provide any additional cash to the company. Tough messages. And sometimes you have to pivot, right? And a major change of plan is necessary. And as we all know, we as CFOs are hired in part to provide objectivity, right? Data driven strategies that we need to be able to influence and persuade the CEO to at least hear, right? If not, do something based on that information. So now let's completely switch gears and talk about our favorite company experience as a CFO. I know what mine is. Tell me, what was your best CFO job and why?
Well, choosing a favorite, that's a little bit tough. Feels a little bit like being asked which of my three daughters I love the
Oh,
most.
come on.
For the record, I love them all very much and equally, but
But we know you
serious.
must have a favorite.
No, no, I really don't. They're
I
all
do have
they're
a
all great.
favorite, but I only have one. So there you go.
There
It's
you
so
go.
easy.
Well, like so many things in life, it really comes down to the people. And the primary relationship with this is with the CEO, and the fit between the CEO and me as the CFO is critical.
Mhm.
And I tend to spend a lot of time up front putting in energy to really understand and assess the situation with a potential client and its CEO to make sure that we're on the same page as far as the
Mhm.
company's needs and what my initial approach is going to be. This occurs before we mutually sign up for an agreement. And as a result, I really haven't had any CEOs that I didn't enjoy working with because we had already established a certain base level of compatibility on style and thought
Oh, I
process.
certainly have had CEOs that have been very difficult to work for, but I'll leave it at that.
I've, I, I've been lucky, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
very lucky. Trust me.
there are a couple of attributes though that I've noticed in common with the CEOs that I've really enjoyed working with. And I think first would be communication
Mhm.
skills and their
Mm.
ability to convey a vision in a compelling and honest way. Fundraising is a big part of my job, and there may be CFOs out there who can rescue a CEO who muddles through investment presentations, but that's certainly not a superpower that I have.
Mhm.
I can provide great financial leadership and planning, and I can articulate certain elements of the vision. But the CEO really has to be comfortable in the role as the chief communicator for the company.
Mhm.
The other thing I've noticed is those CEOs really tend to know what they know and know what they don't know.
Hmm.
So I love working with experienced CEOs who are well versed in financial matters. And I've even worked with some who've been CFOs earlier in their career. And so they are not shy about articulating their needs and expectations, but they give me the freedom to run finance and planning because they know that I have a playbook that works for me and I deliver what they need. On the other end of the spectrum, I've had fantastic experiences working with some really super bright first time CEOs. And as part of my job, I love teaching and educating. And those CEOs have been able to rapidly pick up enough fluency in finance and accounting concepts that we've been able to have a very productive relationship.
That's great that you've had so many really good relationships with CEOs over the years. Not everyone can say that. I've had some great CEOs that I work with, and then I've had some that have been difficult to deal with because they really haven't wanted to hear some of the messages
Mm.
that I, as the CFO of a company, have had to provide. So good for you, actually. So now let's shift again and talk about financing and kind of expectations for the future in the various sectors that we work in. So, as you know, Greg, the healthcare and life sciences sector was on a financing boom, right, through 2021. And then things started to change dramatically in 2022 and 2023 when money and the ability to finance became very tough. 2022 was the debt financing year. 2023 was really minding your P's and Q's with regard to cash, right? And so far in 2024, things have been pretty rough for both small biotech and med tech device and med technology companies. It's been really, really challenging. So what do you see is on the horizon for these companies for the remainder of 2024? And how do you think about these companies making it through these tough times?
Sure. Well, macroeconomist is definitely not a title that you'll see anywhere on my resume. But I will say that in the medical device industry, where many of my clients have been, it feels like the last 10 to 15 years have been a challenging environment, actually. I think there are various factors for this, including the increased time and cost for getting new devices approved and covered by insurance, which has kind of reduced the appetite a bit on the part of investors for devices compared to biopharma.
Although I
And,
think it's starting to come back a little bit. That's
it,
my
it,
own
it may
opinion.
be.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit.
Hopefully some green shoots there.
Yeah.
But medical devices used to be much faster and cheaper to get approved compared to drugs, and that's a little bit less true now. But the challenges to rolling out a medical device commercially, those still exist. You have to get doctors interested enough to go through the time that it takes to train and become proficient with a new procedure, and that takes time, effort, a lot of buy-in. Much more than it takes to write prescriptions for drugs. So as a result, I've really seen, I would say recently, quite a few more non-traditional financings than traditional VC financing. So that includes a lot of convertible notes, corporate VC investments, offshore funds, large family offices, et cetera. And I think in this environment where capital is hard to come by and expensive for pre-revenue companies, I go back to what we talked about earlier. Treat your capital as a precious resource, sequence your activities to spend most of your early expensive dollars exclusively on retiring those fundamental risks so that you can fund the rest of your plan later with cheaper dollars.
I think that's phenomenal advice for any CFO in the medical tech or device areas to really adhere to. Because I remember back in my day, which was 90s and early 2000s, when I was at med tech companies, your typical company, it was 8 to 9 years at the max, right? Before you were either going IPO or acquired. And now it's in the double digits, right? It's 12 to 14 years sometimes because of everything you just said. So completely agree with your assessment, Greg. Again, shifting gears. Now let's talk about how you expanded your career, how you came to FLG Partners, and what do you focus on with us so that your clients know that?
Yeah. So after those early roles, I went on to serve on a couple of other venture-backed startups. And then starting in 2013, I took on consulting roles, acting as part-time CFO for multiple companies. And within a year, I was pretty much fully booked with client work and realized that I loved what I was doing and would work that way for the rest of my career. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that it allows me to work with Series A, Series B companies who need a CFO, but they don't need a full-time CFO. So I can focus on doing what I'm good at for however many hours a week the company needs, and put in place others like controllers who can more cost-effectively do the things that don't require my skill set. Second, it provides me with a pace of learning that's very rapid, and that makes me a better CFO for all of my clients. So, for example, when I do a deep dive on which banks are offering the best terms for venture debt for pre-revenue companies and what the gotchas are, that current know-how knowledge is helpful for all of my clients, really. And then finally, and this one can sound a little bit strange, is that I can actually offer more stability and continuity to a client often than a full-time CFO. There's enough ebb and flow in my work that I've always been able to manage a fluctuating load. And so if a company goes through a tight period and we have to cut back on cost for a while, for example, while we wait for clinical study results, I can temporarily ramp down my involvement a bit to an appropriate level. I don't have to jump ship to another company because I need a full-time paycheck. Conversely, when things get really busy on the financing front, such as in the middle of a fundraising, I have enough
Mhm.
flexibility in my schedule to ramp up with the company's needs. So in any case, just a couple of years into my consulting career, I got to know a couple of the partners at FLG and became familiar with FLG's stellar reputation.
Yay! I had
You
to
know,
throw that
I
in.
was
Sorry,
very
Greg.
happy. You know, I was really thriving on my own, but I'd always thought, you know, if I were ever to join up with a firm, FLG is the only firm that I would consider. And in 2021, the timing was right, and I became increasingly attracted to the idea of continuing to do what I was doing, but with a strength that comes from being part of this fantastic team that we have here at FLG. So I went through our extensive evaluation process, joined FLG, brought the clients that I had at the time with me to the
Mhm.
firm. And then here at FLG, I've really continued to do that work with privately held technology related companies, the majority of which, but not all, have been in life science, so including medical device and diagnostics.
So far, so good. Tell us how it's been. What are you most looking forward to in the next few years in terms of what you're doing with us?
Yeah, well, I came in with very high expectations, and being part of FLG has truly exceeded those expectations. Absolutely. And there are a lot of things to like here, but I think for me,
Mhm.
one of the most notable
Mhm.
is this incredible base of knowledge that we have. Out of our
Yeah.
30 CFO partners, we have, I believe, almost 1,000 years of cumulative CFO experience,
Yep.
and that's at my fingertips anytime I need it to get an introduction to a vendor, uh, to get some guidance on a situation that maybe I've never seen before,
Mhm.
or just to
Mhm.
bounce ideas. And that's a really incredible resource to have. And you'd asked what I'm looking forward to. And
Yeah.
this might not sound very exciting to say, but I actually look forward to doing more of the same. And by that, I mean that of all of my roles at FLG, I've had the pleasure of spending most of my time on problem solving, which I really like. I like challenges, and it doesn't get boring because each company has its own set of unique challenges that evolve over time. And most of those intersect in some ways with the things that we deal with as CFOs, the strategy, the planning, et cetera. And so I can make use of my 20 plus years of CFO experience to identify certain patterns that help inform solutions, but each situation is different, and that keeps it lots of fun.
That sounds great, and I agree with you that the fundamental exceptionalism of FLG is twofold, in my opinion. One is this unbelievable bench strength that we have in our three major sectors, right? Healthcare, technology, and companies that touch the consumer, CPG type of companies, apps, mobile apps, e-commerce. And then the second, I think, point of exceptionalism at FLG is that we can tap into 30 other partners for information for how did you do this? What do you think? Is this a right solution? Do you have any ideas for me? I mean, using that knowledge base is terrific, as we go through our jobs as being a CFO. So thank you, Greg, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for joining us and listening to Greg's perspectives as an experienced CFO in healthcare, life sciences, and consumer companies. And I hope our audience enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Greg, for joining us today.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Bye-bye.